Hi, I'm Mark Kelly, and welcome to the show. Well, when he left office, he was one of the most unpopular presidents in U.S. history. And for nearly 2 years, George W. Bush seemed happy to fade into the background hum of history. That is, until now. His memoir, Decision Points, hits the shelves tomorrow. And according to NBC News, which interviewed Bush for his book, the former president, quote, has some things to get off his chest. George W. Bush has always made it clear presidents are decisionators.
But I'm the decider, and I decide what is best.
Well, guess what Decision Points is all about?
And it's a way for me to put the reader in the environment in which I had to make decisions.
It was an environment where he was repeatedly blindsided. He writes that he was shocked to find that after invading Iraq to find weapons of mass destruction, there weren't any. And he now regrets cutting troop levels early in the war.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended.
When the CIA asked him if they could waterboard prisoners, he gave them the green light.
All the techniques that we've used have been deemed to be lawful.
But he writes that he was shocked by the scale of prisoner abuse in the hands of U.S. troops in Iraq's Abu Ghraib prison. Bush admits his most painful moment came in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, not because of his response.
Don't tell me the federal response was slow when there was 30,000 people pulled off roofs right after the storm passed.
No, his low point came from this statement by hip-hop star Kanye West.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
Were you watching?
Nope.
You remember what he said?
Yes, I did. He called me a racist.
Well, what he said was George Bush doesn't care about black people.
That's because he's a racist. And I didn't appreciate it then. I don't appreciate it now. It's one thing to say, I don't appreciate the way he's handled his business. It's another thing to say this man's a racist. I resent it. It's not true. And it was one of the most disgusting moments of my presidency.
Bush hasn't made peace with Kanye, but he has made peace with his decisions. Question is, has anyone else? Well, the response to Hurricane Katrina in 2005 is widely seen as a blot on Bush's presidency. And the man who was right there while Bush was busy deciding what to do was the deputy director of FEMA, the federal agency in charge of that response, Michael Brown, or as Bush liked to call him, Brownie. Well, Brown was appointed to FEMA in 2003, reportedly with little experience in disaster management. When images of the hurricane's devastation fueled public rage at government inaction, Brown took the heat and Bush support didn't help.
Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job.
For critics, it was an endorsement of incompetence. Brown resigned from FEMA. Barack Obama was able to win the Oval Office by promising change. Now he's facing some pretty terrible approval ratings of his own. In February, a billboard turned up in Minnesota that drove that point home. At first, it was dismissed as a hoax, but numerous sightings confirmed it. A picture of Bush with the caption, "Miss me yet?" Well, according to the polls, when he left office, Bush's approval rating was a dismal 22%. Since then, his post-presidential approval has doubled, about 45%. Obama's approval now sits at 47%, making him only marginally more beloved, quote-unquote, than Bush. Well, Bush has always said that history will take decades to judge his legacy, but we're going to take a crack at it tonight. Nigel Hamilton is a political historian, the author of American Caesars. It's a look at every U.S. president since the Second World War, from FDR to W. He joins me tonight. Nigel, thank you for talking to us. And you've taken a look at these last 12 American presidents. Where does George W. Bush stack up against the competition?
Not very well, in my view. I begin with FDR because he was really responsible for creating the modern American empire by necessity after Pearl Harbor and once the United States acquired atomic weapons. And he was succeeded by some wonderful presidents, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy, and some really remarkable men leading the American empire. But I think once it came to George W. Bush, whose father had already been president, but who had very little administrative experience other than as governor in Texas, I think it was all downhill, really. I think he clearly is the worst president of the last 100 years.
Wow.
And I say that not because I dislike him in any way, but simply because of the ravages, really, of his 8 years in power.
And so what would you point to in particular? And I know there are a lot of examples, but I'm sure as you're doing research, I mean, what really stands out in terms of being, you know, the deepest damage that he caused in his 8 years in power?
Well, the greatest damage was obviously abroad in choosing after 9/11, becoming obsessed with getting rid of Saddam Hussein instead of Osama bin Laden, deciding to occupy Afghanistan rather than going for Osama bin Laden, and then immediately, before he'd actually produced order in the country, invading Iraq. That's in terms of his abilities on a global stage. But even at home, his performance, I think, has been deeply divisive, partly through the men that he chose to be his cohort, in particular his vice president, Dick Cheney, and Karl Rove, his advisor.
But I wonder, too, when we look back on the Bush presidency, I mean, there was, you know, the terrorist attacks, the natural disasters, the economic collapse. How much can you blame Bush for what happened as opposed to just, you know, that he was there at the time when all of this was happening?
Well, look, I mean, we all have to be reasonably empathetic and to try and put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who takes this enormous responsibility as President of the United States. And obviously it was a huge shock, not just to George Bush, to the whole nation when the Twin Towers fell. But George Bush had the unity of the country behind him after 9/11. And the way he squandered that in pursuing these nation-building notions on a completely unilateral basis, really irrespective of allies. I mean, the way he treated the British, for instance, was really remarkable compared with his predecessors. Almost no American president had ever tried to dominate the entire world without at least trying to get allies behind him. His own father, for instance, in Desert Storm, had made quite sure he would not invade Iraq unless he had the support of other nations, especially the United Nations. It was this unilateralism, this sort of arrogance and sort of bully boy approach to international politics that I think really makes him quite different from any other president since FDR. George W. Bush had hardly ever traveled outside the United States when he became president. And all this was masked by this, they called him the brain, by this man, Karl Rove, who'd been with him for many years and was really trained in the stable of Lee Atwater, the archetypal dirty tricks campaigner.
Nigel Hamilton, thank you for talking to us tonight.
Not at all.